Thank you all for joining us today for a CURT Construction Users Roundtable webinar on sustainability in construction space, a value chain perspective sponsored by Procore. I'm Rana Dubrow. I'm the Director of Membership at CURT, and I'm pleased to welcome you to a great discussion. Thank you in advance to our participants, Chris Peterson, Tiffany Rodriguez, and Doug Dietrich. A couple notes. First of all, our apologies. During this time of our pivoting after the pandemic, we've noticed that every now and then something new happens, and this was a first time for us today where our link was considered not to be valid. So I do apologize for that, and thank you all for very quickly making the pivot to the new link. If you would please remain on mute during the webinar and feel free to utilize the chat box to submit questions. This webinar is being recorded and a link to the recording will be emailed to all registered participants. Now I'd like to introduce Chris Peterson, Executive Director with the Electric Utility Industry Sustainable Supply Chain Alliance, also known as EUISSCA. This alliance includes 21 of the leading U.S. electric power utilities whose mission is to drive sustainability onto the supply chain. Chris is also an Associate Director with Anthesis Group, the world's largest dedicated sustainability consulting group, working primarily in the area of sustainability, strategy, assessment, and development. Chris, welcome. And I'm passing the microphone now to you to introduce our other participants.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Rona. Really appreciate that and appreciate everybody joining today and navigating the technical issues as we've been navigating the, looks like I'm switching audio. Look at that. The challenges never end. So I'm very excited today to be joining all of you and having an opportunity to speak about sustainable construction. And I'm very pleased to be joined by two very good friends, people that are really big influencers within our utility space, as well as deep thinkers around both the opportunities and solutions that we can be pursuing around sustainability. And those are Tiffany Rodriguez, who's joining us by phone today. From PG&E, and Tiffany is recently appointed as the Supply Chain Responsibility Manager with them, and is really doing an amazing job at driving sustainability into their supplier practices, their purchasing decisions, and engagement both within the organization and across the value chain. So looking forward to hearing her perspectives on this. And then also joined by Doug Dietrich, who is the Sustainability Manager at Burns & McDonnell. And Doug is, again, a great influencer within the industry and will be bringing in a supplier perspective that we all really value. Doug sits on our supplier advisory board and really helps us to think about how do we improve? Where are the opportunities? Where are the challenges? And what are some of the solutions within that space? So when we connected, thinking about how best to present and convey some of the thinking, what we decided we would do is I will provide a 50,000-foot view of sustainable construction for those of you who are new to this space or new to some of the terminology. And then we will hand it over to Tiffany to provide a perspective from a procurement buyer viewpoint of a leading organization and what that looks like and some of the activities that they're pursuing within PG&E. And then we'll have Doug round us out with a supplier view and the way that that is manifesting within the Burns & McDonnell spot in the value chain. Throughout, please, as Rona mentioned, input your questions into the chat. We'd love to pick those up. We'll pause between each of our sections to answer any immediate questions, but then we'll also plan to have some time at the end for some of the deeper conversations or deeper questions or a broader discussion of re-emphasizing some of the highlights that we hit throughout. So with that, allow me to share a few just high-level perspectives, as mentioned, that we wanted to share around this. And You know, when we're thinking about where to start, we're really thinking about kind of before we even get into buildings, what are the key drivers that are bringing us here today? What are the things that are underlying a lot of the interest around sustainability, the likely kind of uptick that you are seeing amongst your customers asking about sustainability and drivers within that? And you know, there's so much going on, but really trying to distill it down to what are the three key things or three things that you may want to keep top of mind as you go through this. So the first is that picture on the left. That is a heat map that shows the change in temperature from 1900 to 2000 across the US. And the ones in dark red are a 4-degree Fahrenheit shift over that time. And what's kind of driving a lot of this around climate change, around the impacts of climate change, around the kind of tipping point we're hitting around weather patterns, et cetera, is that, you know, that took us 100 years to have that fundamental shift in the way that we were being affected by the climate. And the forecasts say that that's going to double that shift by 2030. So, you know, just that much more. And I think that's something that we are experiencing across the US today, right? Where we see, my brother is based out of Vancouver, BC, where most or a significant number of the houses have single pane windows and poor insulation. Just wasn't a driver. And it is over 115 today. And so they're really reacting to this fundamental shift that we are seeing continually, both there and in other kind of climate weirding around the world. So climate change is the key driver that's driving a lot of discussion around sustainability, but it's not the only piece. You know, the second picture you see in there is a picture of downtown Manhattan, as you may have recognized, you know, and that brings us to the consideration around materials. So as the building space, construction materials are a significant driver of total consumption around the world. The forecasts predict that we're going to double the total amount of building and infrastructure footprint over the next 20 to 30 years. And as a consequence, that is the equivalent of us building an entire Manhattan every month for the next 40 years. So just the volume of materials that we're bringing in is cascading impacts around the world, both in terms of where we source those materials from, you know, the challenges, the competition for those materials that, you know, in the worst case manifest in civil wars or social unrest within various parts of the world, you know, create significant biodiversity, material impacts, impacts on the environment, et cetera, that are difficult for us to scale back. You know, and so just as an example, when we think about the scale of total impacts that we're seeing, the UN predicts that by 2100, we would need 3 times the total materials we have on the earth to sustain our current consumption patterns. You know, so clearly something that is not sustainable. And that's kind of reflective of what we're seeing, both on the climate front, on the social front, on the materials consumption, on waste and other kind of impacts that we consider within the sustainability space, is really hitting this roadblock of kind of the end of what we can consume blindly within that, and starting to come to terms with that. And that really brings us to the third image you see here, which maybe many of you recognize, is the CEO, Larry Fink of BlackRock, one of the world's largest institutional investment firms. And you know, I put that up there because it's really representing the pivot, the shift that we've seen within the investment community that is really waking up to those realities. You know, there's been a period that we've been able to kind of keep our heads down, you know, discount, ignore the impacts of climate change, of material consumption, et cetera. But those really have come home to roost now. And the investment community is recognizing, you know, the significant risks that are embedded within our current business model, consumption patterns, et cetera, and especially for long-lived investments such as buildings, such as the investments that electric utilities need to make, et cetera. Investors are really scrutinizing how that value will be sustained through the life of that asset. And so, you know, that's a pretty fundamental shift that we've seen building for a number of years, but really hitting that tipping point over the last 6 to 18 months if you will. So, important to keep all of this in mind, and that really lays the foundation for sustainability writ large around that. But then how does that manifest from a building perspective? And maybe here, just two key stats to be flagged for us as we think about that. One is when we think about total emissions related to construction and buildings, what you see here is that nearly 40% of global emissions are tied to the construction sector. Big parts of that are tied into the electricity consumption that buildings undertake during their operation. But then close to 10% of global emissions are tied to the embedded emissions in the materials that we are picking and selecting for our construction projects. So that affects everything from roads to office towers to our individual homes. The second piece to keep in mind is that, as you can see from this graphic, construction materials are a dominating factor in global material demand. So, when we think about kind of those drivers that we're seeing for total consumption growth, the limits that we have from an environmental capacity to maintain our consumption patterns, and then you layer on top the predominance of construction and really driving that material consumption, you can see that, this is really driving awareness, concern, risks for us, both within the industry and as a broader society, and thinking about how best do we develop and perform sustainably over the long term if our existing models have a very clear kind of end date to them, if you will. So it's not all doom and gloom, though that happens a lot when we start talking about sustainability and the challenges that are in front of us. When we think about the opportunities that sustainability creates, and the opportunities that it creates for us within the building construction space, it's really encouraging to consider, both the value that's created by our activities, as well as the reduced operating impacts, consumption, et cetera, that come along with that. So just a few stats that we look to, that we point to, that we really value when we think about office space in particular. But a lot of these map to the infrastructure impacts, the infrastructure investments that we will be making as well. Particularly from an asset perspective, seeing this growth in asset value. So the investments in sustainable design and material selection, et cetera, those developers are seeing higher asset values for their properties. We're seeing increased lease rates. This was drawn from a study in LA as one example. We see increased benefits both from public and occupant health from buildings. So whether that's the design of the building, enabling kind of an active community, fostering contributions to the wider area around the building, whatever that may be, as well as significant contributions to both GDP growth and job creation as part of this. And then from a reduction perspective, we see a significant reduction in operating costs, significant reduction in energy consumption, significant reduction in water consumption, as well as material diversion as all part of that significantly reduced impact. So it really speaks to both the value that's being created and the business case that exists for investing in more sustainable solutions, as well as the importance of that and really pulling down the impacts of our industry as we look forward. And then finally, as we look ahead to where sustainable construction, green building, et cetera, is going, what we've seen is just this continual expansion of the responsibility of buildings, the opportunities that are created around that, and the expectations from a sustainability perspective. So when we think back to the nascent versions of the US Green Building Council and their definition of a sustainable building, that was really around energy efficiency. LEED stands for Leadership in Energy Efficiency Design, right? And that has expanded to include both the overall kind of material selection that goes into those buildings, as well as waste coming out of those buildings, the human health aspects of that, and now more broadly into considerations of what are the contributions to the community, the society, whether that's through procurement or whether that is through the design position of the building going forward. And as that expands, now what we're seeing is this consideration, how does that map to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a group of United Nations developed 17 goals of how we define a more sustainable society. And this is just one example of how office buildings in particular contribute to a wide number of those. So whether that's using circular principles to drive a more responsible consumption and production pattern, or contributing to local economy and job boosting or sourcing locally to drive benefits within that. Again, this broader perspective of it. So as mentioned, I want to just give a very high level view of some of the drivers, some of the trends that we're seeing within the space to hopefully set the stage for some of the discussions we're having about how does that map to, how does that reflect upon engagement in the value chain. And so just before I hand it over to Tiffany to take us through kind of the PG&E experience, I saw there was a question in the chat regarding the operating costs being reduced. And what we're seeing there is really related to the efficient operation of the building. So whether that is designing for daylighting to reduce lighting costs, whether that is orienting the building to reduce heating or cooling costs associated with the building, all of those are adding up in order to really drive a kind of reduced overall operating cost. And that study was actually based off of the General Service Administration that mapped 22 of their green buildings that they had developed and compared those to a wider portfolio of standard buildings so that they could do a true apples to apples comparison of them. And then a question just about green offices create more employment than building traditional offices. What we see within that space is really more of a focus around what are the broader contributions that we can be making. And so that may be, either sourcing locally as options around that. That may be, breaking up contracts so that multiple vendors can be bidding on those contracts and contributing to the wider perspective within that. So there's multiple different pieces, but it's one of these things of putting some focus on it, some highlights, some aspirations around how do we drive that job creation? How do we drive those local contributions, and how do we measure those so that we can then be bringing them into and delivering and managing against those best performance characteristics within them? So great questions. Thank you for submitting those. Hope we get more that come in. But before I steal any more thunder from our speakers, please allow me to pass it over to Tiffany to provide a perspective as a kind of buyer from PG&E and a customer within this space, and how sustainability is looking from your viewpoint. So Tiffany, I'll drive your slides and hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Kurt, for the opportunity to speak. I appreciate it. Again, my name is Tiffany Rodriguez. I'm the Manager of Supply Chain Responsibility at PG&E, and I lead efforts to help PG&E do basically two things: reduce the environmental impact of the goods and services we purchase, to try to influence purchasing to buy items that have lower carbon, use less water, less energy, et cetera. But then I also have a large portion of my role that focuses on engaging our suppliers to help them reduce their environmental impact. And that's really what I'm going to focus on in this conversation. We have had for several years engagements with suppliers to help them, again, improve their environmental performance. We really upped the game on this and focused our efforts specifically as of some of the results of activities done in 2020. We had an engagement with the Alliance, USCA, the Electric Utility Industry Sustainable Supply Chain Alliance, learned that a majority of the greenhouse gas emissions that occur in our supply chain, so in the goods and services that we buy, occur in basically three categories: construction services, vegetation management, and manufacturing. Now that we knew that, we now had a place to focus. How can we address and support the suppliers in those industries to help them be successful in reducing environmental impact so they can help us be successful, since they are an extension of PG&E's environmental footprint? So we worked on a few things. We had created, as a department, a greenhouse gas training for our suppliers to teach them how to measure the greenhouse gases in their operations. We took that training and really amped it up, focused it specifically for, again, those three industries, and helped them understand where could they implement activities to reduce to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. How could they look at using fuels differently? How could they look at electrification of fleets, change their energy efficiency in their buildings, just update manufacturing process, et cetera? What could they look at to help drive emissions reductions? And then how, literally the nuts and bolts of how to calculate emissions. We gave them homework to gather emissions data sources, number of trucks, number of gallons used in a year, electric bill data, so that we could help them actually calculate their previous period's emissions. And then we'll be engaging with them later this year to gather and have them report that data to us. So we really took a very hands-on approach to support the suppliers. We recognize many of our suppliers are small, diverse businesses. They may not have the resources to hire consultants or attend training workshops to give them the knowledge to help meet our expectations. So we created training and rolled out and delivered training to really help them get that under their belt. One of the reasons being is it helps them meet our supplier environmental performance expectations. We've had those in place since 2012, and basically we expect our suppliers, not a requirement, but an expectation, that they measure their main environmental impacts, that they set reduction goals, and that they publicly report their performance and their performance against their goals. We host workshops to teach our suppliers what that means, how to do it. And for some of our suppliers, our more top suppliers, scorecarded suppliers, ones that are more critical to our operations, we review and ensure that they are doing this based on their response to our annual sustainability assessment, and they're scored on their annual performance scorecard on how well they're meeting our expectations. So the third item there, the third column, relates to our supplier sustainability assessment. We roll this out in addition to the other 20 members of the Alliance, the Electric Alliance, and annually we ask our suppliers to respond to an industry-specific assessment. They identify their industry and answer a series of questions about how well they're implementing best practices that have been identified that, again, are specific to their industry. So construction firms are being asked, what are they doing in regards to excavation? What are they doing in regards to on-site job lighting? They're not being asked as much about, double-sided printing and things like that, because it's not really material for a construction supplier. So we have them answer this annual assessment. The supplier gets value, and there's very detailed benchmarking that they can leverage to understand how they're doing relative to their peers, how they can improve their performance over time. They can create development plans in this system. The website, if you ever want to go, it's free for use for the public. It's TSP, just like you see there, tspproject.org. And it's really a tool that's created to help suppliers understand where their environmental impacts are in their industry and what they can do to improve in their performance. And again, we review their responses and we assess them against our environmental performance expectations so that we can understand how well are our suppliers doing to meet our expectations. One of the newest ventures that we've set out is something that I've championed. Once we found out that the majority of our environmental impact is in, again, construction, veg management, and manufacturing, we recognized that we had to pull together resources for buyers, for suppliers, for people in standards departments. What are the environmental attributes that we should be looking for when picking materials, when designing jobs, when constructing jobs? As Chris mentioned, the products that we put, they have long lifespans. They are heavy, intense carbon materials. They use a lot of water. They use a lot of energy. So how can we make good decisions up front to have lower impact construction projects that are going to last, 50, 60, 100 years into the future. Let's think about how to improve our design and execution of construction projects today to have better outcomes. So we formed a group with the utility members as well as supplier affiliate members from the Alliance to create a sustainable infrastructure construction playbook. So we aren't touching on, vertical construction. We're really looking at the construction that utilities are going to be doing, transmission lines, substations, excavation, boring, drilling, et cetera. And how can we decide and, again, influence those projects to be more sustainable? So we are soliciting best practices from all the utilities, the suppliers on the call, and really trying to find the best resources, calculators, tools that we can share to easily spread knowledge to help make informed, good decisions. In the future, we'll have more chapters. Right now, we're working on just the materials selection chapter, which is focused on concrete, asphalt, poles, wire, and cable. But we'll be focusing on other chapters about design, planning, execution of work, and really understand how from beginning to end, we can make sustainable infrastructure construction common, make it easy, and make it understood. We want suppliers to bring these ideas to the table because we want to give them this resource, but we also want utilities to be asking for these attributes when they're designing projects and having suppliers build them. Next slide. Is it on the next slide? I'm sorry, I can't see. I just want to make sure before I start speaking.
It is, yeah. Yeah, thanks, David.
Okay, thanks. So we engage heavily, PG&E, members of my team members, different members throughout our company engage heavily with the Alliance to advance this work. We will go much farther together as utilities, trying to standardize efforts, trying to make efforts more common across the things we do. Now, we do have very strict antitrust guidelines and very strict policies to make sure that we are being all above board with this. But if there are ways that as industry we can move, that will only help us and it will help the suppliers that are supporting us along the way. So we engage quite heavily with the Alliance group to try to minimize the cost to us to research these things, to develop this kind of guidance and really connect and work with similar companies to make sure that we're looking at the right thing and doing the right thing. So again, I mentioned earlier the hotspot assessment. That was something really groundbreaking that we did as a group. Several utilities got together. We looked at the areas where we are spending money, and we, again, determined that we are spending a lot of money with construction, but that also then happens to be where a lot of the emissions are occurring. So it is, yes, our highest spend, but it has even a higher emissions relative to that spend. So we know we have to focus as a utility on figuring out how we can implement better construction practices, how we can engage our suppliers to reduce their environmental impact. What should we be doing to partner on this effort together since we know now it's an issue? We've engaged with concepts of investment recovery, and that goes hand in part with the sustainable construction. When you're demolishing something or when you have end-of-life assets, what do you do with them to keep them out of landfill? Do they have a reuse value? Do they have a resale value? Do they have a recycle value? What should be done to keep the product out of landfill to help minimize the environmental impact of that project, from beginning to end? And then, as we talked about in the sustainable construction, designing with the end in mind. So considering and researching and advocating for products that have a useful purpose or some value at the end of life, so it doesn't just go into a dumpster, go into a landfill forever. And again, the knowledge that we're gaining and sharing and learning from each other on the sustainable construction playbook is going to be really valuable to so many throughout the utilities that are making design decisions, purchasing decisions, planning decisions, but also very valuable for our suppliers, giving them the knowledge of there's resources, there's information out there that you suppliers should also be bringing to the table when you're offering or bidding on projects. Ask or offer these resources, these materials, these methods of executing work, and showcase to your client, potential customer, this is how I can help you achieve your environmental goals. And again, the playbook is designed to really give tools, calculators, methods to actually quantify value that will be expected based on implementing different materials, different designs, et cetera. So we're really heavily engaged at PG&E as well as with the Alliance on how we can work together to make sustainable infrastructure construction the norm. How can we design things that will last for a very long time and benefit many? So that's my portion of the presentation. Were there any questions?
That's great. Thanks, Tiffany. Yeah, maybe just a question for me, and maybe you hit on it, but maybe just to re-emphasize, or if there's an example you could point to of kind of what are the practices you would love to see from a supplier? Not necessarily the kind of the specifics, but just that mentality, the approach they take to sustainability. You mentioned kind of bringing those ideas to. Just wondering if maybe you could expand on that just a little bit.
Yeah, the one I've been advocating for quite a bit internally, as well as through the Alliance members, is the use of warm mix asphalt. It's asphalt that's created at a lower temperature. It can be paved on a longer paving day, on a colder paving day. It compacts better. It can be cheaper if enough people desire this over the manufacturing process. It can be cheaper. So there's a whole bunch of win-win-wins that I would hope that suppliers would offer. Hey, here's the bid you asked for. Here's the specification you asked for, and here's an alternative that I'd like to recommend. And share that they're the experts in their field, the suppliers. They know what's new, latest, greatest, and what's available in the markets they serve. Bringing those ideas and really showing how it can provide benefit is what I'd like to see more of. People often produce savings. They show, look, I can save you this. If there's an environmental attribute related to that savings, really highlight that, because people often, they just see the dollars related to the savings, but they may not see the other benefits, waste reduction, water reduction, energy reduction, that are very valuable if you can quantify them and show them to your potential client. That, I think, is a huge win and a huge opportunity.
Perfect. Thanks, Tiffany. Appreciate that. We're getting a number of questions, but I think I'm going to save those for the end, and we'll pass it over to Doug to give a supplier perspective and then kind of bring this back with that. So, Doug, maybe I'll hand it over to you. Thanks again, Tiffany.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Rana and the CURT organization for having us speak with you today. So basically, I think we can go on to our next slide there. There we go. So Burns McDonnell, which is where I work, I'm the sustainability lead here. We're a firm that does quite a bit of work, both design and sometimes construction as well, for a variety of clients across a variety of sectors. That includes electric utilities, but many other client types, public, private, quasi, straddling public and private sectors. But we looked recently at we went back 3 years. We looked at our financials, and we looked at the firms that we do the most business with. And not surprisingly, similar to the typical 80-20 rule, excuse me, we found that 85% of our revenue over the past 3 years came from firms, clients, that were doing at least one of these 5 bullet point items here. So many of the clients assess, they request us to respond to surveys regarding sustainability, and now in addition, the term ESG for environmental social governance. And there is overlap depending on how those terms are specifically defined. But we are being asked really on at least a weekly, but often multiple times a week, what are your metrics? Where are you? What are your commitments? What are your plans? I imagine many of the people on the call here, many of you at your firms are probably also receiving these same inquiries. So we see that, and keep in mind, we're a $5 billion firm. So 85% of revenue for a $5 billion firm, this is a lot of business we're talking about. And so the vast majority, and I would say an increasing percentage of our bread and butter, nuts and bolts, basic clients, this is becoming table stakes. This is what we are asked about every day. Just like Tiffany in her presentation, and you know, Tiffany represents a firm that we do some business with, and we of course would love to do even more business with, like all of our clients. But when Tiffany and PG&E, they talk about, you know, they really have certain expectations about what their partner firms throughout the value chain or supply chain are doing. And so we see this more and more. The firms are reporting their own emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon footprints. They are setting specific public reduction targets. They are investing more and more in renewable energy resources in the transition from a fossil fuel-based economy toward a more sustainable, renewable energy powered or renewable powered economy. So the clients are asking for our metrics. They're reducing their own emissions, setting commitments to reduce their environmental impacts. They are making investments in renewable energy generation. Several of them are listed on various sustainability indices, such as the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And many are publicly committing to seriously decarbonize their enterprises, you know, whether some as early as 2030, some 2040, and of course some 2050. But so we just see this as basic, and it's growing, and this is not a trend or a fad. This is not going away. So next slide, please. And the past slide I mentioned, that really just provides the backdrop for where we find ourselves. So then clearly we see the signs. They're coming at us regularly from multiple directions. So, you know, to summarize what the drivers and then try to come up with associated benefits or impacts related to the drivers, this is what we see. You know, with more focus and more investment and more demonstrated behavior to commit to incorporating more sustainability, not only in our designs, but in our construction practices, we do see this offering the opportunity to create value. And so the positives you see there on the screen, for people that this is maybe, you know, and for many of us, this is a new thing. This is not easy, it's challenging. It's, I mean, I could easily say it can be overwhelming. You know, how do we do this? How do we reduce the emissions that represent 40% of the global total that are associated with construction industry? How do we get our arms around this and really make a difference, have an impact? And one way is you need to get the buy-in from the various constituents. That can be your client, that can be the asset owner, that can be the community where the project is taking place, that can be your own employee owners or you know, partners in your own firm and on your own teams. So if you frame it in terms of a key driver and associated benefit is it's better air quality, it's a better environment. And by the way, both of those things affect our public health. They affect our physical health. They can affect our mental health. And, you know, this is a win-win situation. It's not a red or blue political issue. It's just everyone can agree and come together around those principles. And then another key driver and benefit reason for doing this is perfectly in alignment with the vast majority of our clients and what they are already committing to. And that spans across industries. That includes clients of ours in the oil and gas and chemical industries. These are not traditional industries where you would think they would be necessarily acknowledging or making major shifts, structured, systemic shifts to move toward more sustainability, but they are doing that as we speak. And then, you know, the more we embrace this and get ahead of this, it only creates opportunities for us. It helps our position in a competitive landscape. And by the way, you know, younger people that are graduating or, you know, entering the workforce, they want to work for businesses and industries that are aligning with their values and principles. And they are no longer just settling for, well, I'll do whatever you want as long as it's well paid. They have some higher or different components in their criteria for even interviewing with a firm and looking for work. So we see it as really critical to maintaining a workforce that is top-notch and that we really need to be able to embrace and succeed in the future. Next slide, please. So again, this is similar to the first slide, but these trends, again, for people that might say, well, this is, you know, maybe this is just the pendulum swings back and forth and maybe this is not real. Well, there are sustainability standards in 43 of the states that we operate in. And we're seeing more and more money flowing from projects that were not really demonstrating sustainability or pursuing those more environmentally positive attributes. And we're seeing the money flow to the projects where we can demonstrate and point to the specific sustainability features in the design and the construction practices. And then of course, you know, with the change in the presidential administration in the White House, there is, you know, hopefully the infrastructure package, whatever that turns out to be, I think people from across the spectrum are hoping and expecting there to be more investment in infrastructure, which is going to be a huge boost for jobs in the construction sector. But these jobs come with them the expectation, like Tiffany at PG&E said, there are expectations to innovate, be more progressive, and improve the way that, well, improve upon our traditional performance. Next slide. Okay, now, probably many of you come from a variety of sectors, but this is just one example that I see come across my desk in a literally a requirement, not a recommendation or a please do this, we'd appreciate it. This is a requirement we have received from a major electricity transmission client of ours. And they literally, they have a couple things. The first two bullet points pertain to performance at the firm-wide organizational level. And then the last two, I've even bolded for emphasis a little bit. There are at the project, you know, specific job site level. So the top two, it's, like I said, table stakes. It is not really optional anymore about whether you're going to measure and disclose your greenhouse gas emissions, your water footprint, your waste, you know, your material waste stream footprint, and how much is going to landfill versus being recycled or repurposed. This is a must do now at the organizational level. Probably many of you have already observed that. Then in addition to being transparent about our current environmental impacts, we are now literally being required, again, not just requested, but required to set significant reduction targets. And we are, although it's not necessarily required today, I've been told even this week by a major client, it's not a requirement today, but you can pretty much count on it. In 6 months, it will be a requirement to have, quote, science-based greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. So science-based means in alignment with the Paris Accord of a few years ago. Of course, this November in Glasgow, Scotland, there's going to be another international conference of parties where there will be updated commitments to decarbonization worldwide. And science-based just means following the science of the vast majority, of the consensus reached by the international scientists regarding climate impacts, and following the science so we can try to bend the curve, not surpass a tipping point, to the point where, following on what Chris said at the outset, if we've increased, I think I recall you said 4 degrees Fahrenheit in these average temperatures over the past 100 years, and in the next century, that might be 8 degrees Fahrenheit. So 8 on top of 4 is 12. And if it's 100+ degrees in Portland, Oregon today, I don't know if we want to, I don't know if we want to go there. So if we want to slow that down or avoid that, mitigate the worst, most harmful adverse impacts, we really want to get these science-based targets and do what we can based on the most comprehensive scientific information. So those are considered, we need to get on board because this train has left the station and it's not turning around. But then on a project level, and that's where maybe most of you are even more interested, if you are doing the construction on a job site, we now are seeing requirements that say, when you show up, contractor, on your site for us to build our asset, you are going to show us a plan for how you're going to get to net zero carbon. So in other words, any carbon impacts, emissions, you will offset those fossil fuel emissions one way or the other. You will not be diverting waste. Well, you will not be taking waste to landfills. You will be 100% diverting the waste from landfill. So that, think about all the things that show up on a job site. They're basically saying, reduce the packaging, have take-back programs with your vendors. Work with the engineers up front on the constructability of the project and look for materials that can either be more durable, repurposed, recycled, turned into some, at the end of life, they can be reformulated into some other product that can be useful in terms of economics. And then, of course, there are also, some of us are not familiar with the term natural capital. What they're talking about there, natural capital refers to the environment, biodiversity. Sometimes people refer to these as, quote, ecosystem services. But natural capital is just talking about all the things that naturally come to us that we're able to benefit from, that basically come from the earth. The vegetation, the flora, the fauna, all the different organisms, even soil. Soil is a living organism. Soil isn't just a lifeless material. Soil has all sorts of properties that give life to other things in an entire ecosystem, which usually we don't see or pay too much attention to until maybe it's too late. But again, I think Chris was saying that within what time frame, Chris? I think you said maybe 2021. At the current rates of consumption, at 2021, we'll be consuming 3 times more natural resources than the Earth even has. So that's clearly not sustainable. But anyway, on a per project basis, we are being expected now to do an accounting, literally a documented accounting of our impacts on carbon, waste, and natural capital. And furthermore, this client has requires us, if we want to sign on and sign the contract, we are, quote, committing to achieve carbon neutral construction, partner with them to find ways to be carbon neutral in our construction practices on their jobs by 2026. But they're starting now with the tracking and the plans for how we best might propose to significantly reduce carbon waste and improve natural capital. So these are not going to be easy challenges. I would say these are aspirational. If anybody tells you they've figured out how to do that and they've got the playbook on how to do that today, I don't believe that. But the clear message is we need to work together to figure out approaches to really make significant headway on these, because ultimately, in line with science-based targets, based on our most recent full, quote, normal year, which was probably calendar year 2019, right, for most businesses, we need to take whatever our footprint impacts were in 2019, and science is pretty much telling us within a year or two, we need to reduce those impacts by 50% by 2030. So we've got actually now less than 10 years to reduce our impacts by 50%. So this is what we're seeing. Again, maybe other people are not quite seeing this level of intensity yet, but we're seeing it. And I think we're fairly representative of sectors that do construction. Next slide.
Yeah, and Doug, maybe just looking at the time, now that you've scared everybody with the science-based target realities, maybe just take us through the last couple and then we can look to wrap up.
It's super quick, yeah. Okay, so you all probably can get a copy of these slides at the end. We did some, market research, and we found, there is a spectrum of what firms in our industry and construction currently are doing. So I don't have to talk about this. You can look at it, but there's a spectrum, and I think we each just need to work with our colleagues and figure out, where do we want to move? Most firms are a little bit, on the left side of the 50%, but of course there are some that are over in the 50% and the upper 50%. So just consider where you are on the spectrum, set your targets accordingly. Next slide. And when you get a copy of these slides, or if you don't get them, you can ask me, I'll send you what I have. But there are some great resources. One is called the Supply Chain Sustainability School. You can Google that. It's based in the UK, but Supply Chain Sustainability School. I believe you can access their curriculum at a very affordable rate, if not free. Plus there are some sustainability-oriented frameworks. One's called Envision, another is LEAD, and then another is Sequel, and they all have specific what are called credits relating to construction practices. I urge you to look at those. And the Sustainability School, for example, their coursework, they have specific courses on each of these 5 bullets that are shown here. But there's a lot of exciting work and opportunity, and I'd be happy to speak with any of you and help share resources and collaborate on moving forward. That's it. Next slide, I guess, just has my contact information. Yep.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Doug, and thank you, Tiffany. I know that we are up on time, but maybe just to reemphasize Doug's comments, Rona will be getting these slides out to everybody following the call. And I saw a couple questions around kind of resources, how do you do this, et cetera. Really encourage you to leverage Doug's resources, to reflect on Tiffany's comments. I think what we're seeing across the board is, both that construction playbook could be live, but then there are numerous support and insights and expertise that you can be drawing from for your specific industry. And at the very least, really challenging yourselves around how do we do this better? And the reality is it's not going to be one silver bullet. It's a real combination of multiple pieces coming in. So maybe just with a couple of seconds left, Doug, Tiffany, anything else you would add to that before we hand it back to Rona to wrap up?
I would just,
oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Tiffany.
Go ahead, Doug. Okay, I would
No,
just
really,
say
yeah.
definitely the partnership between suppliers, customers, organizations, third-party entities like CURT, the Alliance, other sustainability organizations, definitely leverage that kind of trifecta to build really strong programs and initiatives.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. And Doug? Oh, I think you're muted.
I know we're happy to, collaborate. Anyone that wants to get in touch, please do, and we'll move forward together. Thank you for your time today.
Great, thanks, Doug. Thanks, Tiffany, and thank you all for listening. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Rona. Thanks for the opportunity.
Great. Well, thank you all. We really appreciate your time, Chris and Tiffany and Doug, and thank you everyone for attending. You will definitely be receiving the slides as well as the link to this recording. And I do urge you to please feel free to join us at additional events with CURT, and I will provide that information to you also in our follow-up email. We will need to be downloading this recording and editing it before we send it out to you. So if you wouldn't mind, give us a few days. It might actually even be next week before we get it out. But in the meantime, everyone, a very happy 4th of July holiday. And again, thank you for your time.